Thank you everyone on Zoom for joining us, for your patience. Thank you everyone here for joining us in the room today. If your second session here with us, welcome back. And for those who are joining for the first time, welcome to week 2 of Metro DC DSA's Anti-Imperialist Summer School teach-in series. This was the second 6-week series. Last week we sort of did an introduction crash course, what is imperialism, to provide some framing and groundwork for the sort of topic that we'll be talking about for the rest of this series. In today's session, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper, focusing on trade, sanctions, and dollar imperialism, which all are very interrelated subjects, as we'll see, that really combine to uphold not just the imperialist world order, but specifically the United States' role as the linchpin, as a hegemonic power within that order. So last week, y'all just listened to me talk to you for an hour. Today, I'll get us started off, and then I'll pass it off to my comrades Kyle and Mihir to talk about trade and dollar hegemony, and then I'll close us out by talking about sanctions today. And of course, at the end, we will have Q&A and time for discussion as well. But to get us started, I want to share this quote for folks. This is from a speech by the chairman of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors, a man named Miran, who gave a speech in April, so just a couple months ago, at a Hudson Institute event, which is a right-wing think tank. I believe the event was here in DC. And throughout this whole speech, which I encourage folks to look up and read, which really is, I think, a very illustrative primary source, about the way that the right, like the far right, the MAGA right here in the US, views the United States' role in the internationalist capitalist system. And what I mean by that is that they see the US, even though, by any standard, is the most powerful country on earth, is the largest beneficiary of global imperialism, they see the United States as a victim. This is, a quote you see here, where he's talking about how the best outcome is one where the US continues to provide peace, prosperity to the rest of the world, but everyone else keeps pulling their weight. This is a theme that you often hear, repeated in Trump speeches. You hear it repeated in the justification, for example, for the tariffs. And in the opening of the speech, Miran says, quote, this is after what he said on the slide, quote, first, the United States provides a security umbrella which has created the greatest era of peace mankind has ever known. Second, the US provides the dollar and treasury securities, which is reserve assets that make possible the global trading and financial system, which has supported the greatest era of prosperity mankind has ever known. Both of these are costly to us to provide. On the defense side, our men and women in uniform take heroic risks to make our nation and the world safer, preserving our liberties generation after generation. And we tax hardworking Americans to finance global security. On the financial side, the reserve function of the dollar has caused persistent currency distortions and contributed, along with other countries' unfair barriers, to unsustainable trade deficits. These have decimated our manufacturing sector and many working-class families and their communities to facilitate non-Americans in trading with each other. So the reason that we decided to open today with this speech from Stephen Miran is because I think it really gets at the heart of the ethos that is underlying all of the sort of economic policies, the trade policies that Trump has taken since getting into office, the tariffs, the trade wars, and all this sort of economic havoc that they have reaped as a result. And I think it's useful framing as we get into the nitty-gritty over the next hour or so, how the US actually functions in the global trade regime, how the US dollar upholds that dominance. It's useful to have this framing to understand sort of the developments that we've all been seeing play out in the headlines over the last several months, and that are likely to continue playing out. So I will pause here and we'll pass it over to my comrade Kyle to talk about the trade system, what we mean when we talk about trade, and how the way global trade is set up reinforces imperialism and specifically US hegemony. So Kyle, over to you.
All right, everyone. So we're going to start talking about trade. I want to emphasize what Renee said about trade, sanctions, dollar hegemony, these things all being interlinked. But just looking at trade and understanding it better, I think it's very important to analyze that Steve Miran quote, this administration, what some of their goals are with trade. As you all know, international trade occurs when countries put their goods and services on the international market, and every country is going to rely in some form or another on trade. But however, like in the globe, there is an asymmetry, there's a core periphery dynamic in trade where the imperialist core will often extract raw materials from developing countries in the developing world, and they will monopolize advanced manufacturing, which leaves the developing world reliant on the core countries for a lot of that advanced technology and advanced products. So starting with raw materials. A key thing to mention when looking at where we have these are 2014, 15 figures, deposits and where a lot of the raw materials in the world comes from. And when looking at global trade, one of the key things to look at is that many of the developed countries in the core countries rely on the temperate region for certain products that aren't available, can't be produced in that region of the world. One example you could look at is coffee. So if you look at coffee over here, Brazil, Vietnam, Colombia, it's roughly 2/3 of the coffee beans produced in the world. You know, you don't have any coffee beans grown in the US, but the US is the highest consumer of coffee in the world. So in that dynamic, there are countries, European countries, US countries, countries in the global north that are just totally dependent on countries near the equator where these goods are only available. Another example we could look at for trade is oil. We can see that the US does have a lot of its own oil in these figures, and 12%. The US is a really large oil producer and there is oil here, yet the US still imports about 40% of its oil, right? There's a variety of reasons for this, it's the type of oil and refinement capability. But the point being that the US is still, even on something like oil, where they have very large reserves, still dependent on trade and importing things like oil. Some other items on here to point out, gold and silver, you can see silver down here, largely Mexico, Peru, China. A lot of the gold and silver hoards, the majority of the world's gold and silver is in the imperialist core. You know, the reserves of those gold and silver that have been taken over the years, they don't actually come from those countries. They've been taken, if any of you are in the open veins of Latin American or reading group, that's something that book by Edward Galeano talks about, how that gold and silver was taken from the global south and now build up Europe, US, all of these countries where gold and silver has been produced. So one other key thing to talk about here is what are called rare earth elements. They've been in the news a lot recently because in terms of the trade war, they've been a key negotiating point. Rare earth elements are critical in global trade because they're used for things like EVs, smartphones, medical equipment, right? All of the things mentioned here. They're also key for any type of a Green New Deal or a green economy, because nearly any green technology is dependent on having access to rare earth elements. And why this is a big deal is because these reserves are only in certain countries, right? Primarily BRICS countries and especially China. So the BRICS reserves have BRICS collectively, including China, have about 75% of all identified rare earth element reserves. And in terms of, if you look at refining capabilities, China has 90% of the world's refining capabilities in terms of rare earth elements, right? So it's a huge amount of leverage, given how critical these rare earth elements are in creating new types of technologies. So if you look at the trade negotiations in the news, one of the things you've been seeing is China has a licensing system, right, where they allow their manufacturers and their processors to export these rare earth elements. And something that they've restricted recently because of the tariff war has been those licenses that allow the export of those rare earth elements. Now, on the other side, we can look at where does advanced manufacturing happen, right? And it happens largely in the imperial core, and developing countries are often very reliant for advanced types of manufacturing. On here, a few examples, we can see semiconductor manufacturing, commercial aircraft manufacturing, I think in defense aircraft, and then pharmaceutical manufacturing, how it's very concentrated in certain sectors, the US, Europe, parts of Asia. A variety of factors contribute to this. I'll name off a few. One is that these types of advanced manufacturing processes are very capital intensive, they're very expensive. So if any of you have heard of ASML, it's a company from the Netherlands, they make these lithography machines that are used for chip design for advanced chips. One of those machines, a single machine costs about $400 million, right? So this type of advanced manufacturing, the capital intensive nature of it is the first obstacle for a developing country to be able to access this type of thing. Another one is what's called the brain drain, where you have skilled professionals, people like engineers, doctors, nurses, right? It's happened a lot in places like India, Philippines, Nigeria, where those skilled professionals will leave their country for higher paying, higher wages in the US and Europe. So that gives there's a lack of that skilled workforce needed for a lot of these advanced R&D processes and manufacturing technology. Third obstacle, foreign monopolies are often preventing the development of domestic manufacturing. There's a variety of ways that they do this. Sometimes it's dumping goods into the market at very cheap prices that local manufacturing can't compete with. Sometimes it's by force, either through lawfare and legal means, sometimes military means. In the case of Yugoslavia, where they had a pretty developed car manufacturing capability that was destroyed through war. Bolivia had some EV manufacturing capabilities under Evo Morales, but that eventually was through political means, and a coup was kind of prevented from flourishing there as well. The last one I wanted to touch on is the effect of intellectual property and patents. Western patents often prevent technology transfer and the ability to access that technology for advanced manufacturing. Something to note is you may have seen China through economic and political deals, especially in Africa, has committed to technology transfers as part of partnerships. So in some regard, this is putting some pressure on the West to also make concessions in terms of some of the technology transfers. Now over to the accounting side for international trade. So economists will use something called the balance of payments, which is essentially the accounting of all international transactions. So the formula for that, there's two parts to it. It's the current account plus the financial and capital accounts, and those always cancel out. It's all of the trades back and forth, and they always total out to zero. So the current account definitionally shows the trades in goods and services, income flows, and unilateral transfers. So to remember that and think about the current account, it's generally stuff regular people, non-investors, right? When you buy something from another country, like for example, if you buy a car from Toyota, right, that's going to be in the current account. The capital account, on the other hand, that's going to report purchases of assets and liabilities. And right, instead of just thinking about like regular people and things they're buying, you think about investors. So you're buying stocks, bonds, or equity, taking out loans. That's what's all gonna fall under the capital and financial accounts. A few other examples up here, things in the current account, talk about cars, income flows, right? So a company that's earning interest from government bonds in another country, and then unilateral transfer, that's gonna be things like remittances that go to a country, and then also aid, right? Foreign aid to Ukraine that fall under there. Examples for the capital account, that's gonna be things like foreign wealth funds, right, that are buying US Treasury bonds or foreign pension funds, buying stocks in US companies. Foreign direct investment is another big one there. That's foreign companies that are investing to build hard assets. One recently was TSMC built the semiconductor facility, that manufacturing facility in Arizona. That's what Biden hears at the launch of. And then various types of other non-standard flows, things like opening US dollar accounts for, Saudi oil companies and dollar swaps and things of that nature. To talk a little bit about the current balance of trade, especially in regards to the US. The US runs a current account deficit. We hear a lot about the US as a trade deficit, right? But if we remember that relationship where the current account and the financial and capital accounts always equal zero, that's offset by capital account surplus, right? Which means that the US is buying a lot of goods, right? But then when those dollars go to another country, right, those dollars are going to come back in the capital account when pension funds in Japan, the Saudi Wealth Fund buys US bonds, for example. That's known, there's a term for that called dollar recycling. Global South will buy up the US debt to prop up imperialism. Right, this is also what keeps the US dollar afloat, and keeps the US dollar as the world reserve currency. We'll come back to this later when we talk about the US dollar. And as I mentioned, the US runs a trade deficit with many countries, and part of the reason for that is because the US has diminished in terms of its manufacturing capability as the economy has financialized, focused on the service sector. So we can see on the right here, these are the main trading partners for countries around the world. In 2000, the US was primarily the largest trading partner for, especially in the Western Hemisphere. Around 2000 is when China joined the World Trade Organization, so it's a major turning point. And we can see in 2024, the picture is a lot different, right? We're now, most countries in the world, their main trading partner is with China. Right? And that's part of what's contributing to the fact that on the left here is the US balance of trade, which the US now runs a deficit with countries like Mexico, Canada, China. So when we heard recently about tariff wars and reciprocal tariffs, had to deal with trying to get down these deficits that the US runs with all of these countries. One thing to point out is the US runs very large manufacturing deficits, but a lot of that is offset by a surplus for services. So in many of these countries where you see the US, like I think the UK is a good example, where the US is running a surplus. A lot of that is primarily driven by services that the US provides to the UK, primarily to London, and things like consulting, legal, and financial fees. So the US is offsetting to some extent the deficit in manufacturing through the service economy. So now just a brief timeline of kind of how we've got to where we are and some, major events in trade. So the general agreement on tariffs and trade was a precursor to the WTO that reduced tariffs after World War II. At the time, the US was the main manufacturing power and wanted to export its goods globally when it had that power, so it's beneficial to establish this. One additional event not on here in 1985 is the Plaza Accords under Ronald Reagan. Some have said something similar to what Trump is trying to do in that he kind of pressured Germany and Japan into appreciating their currencies because it would make US exports more competitive. It had to do with dollar being strong and US exports being difficult. So there's some people that think term Mar-a-Lago Accords have been thrown out, that Trump is trying to do something similar to what Reagan did in 1985 with the Plaza Accords. In 1995, the WTO was established. There were some, faults of the TATT that were addressed there, right? They added more of a framework for intellectual property was one of them. There's been a huge expansion in that field, the amount of intellectual property and what was needed for it. Yeah, and then there's some other minor changes. 1994, NAFTA was established, a free trade zone. Among other things, it allowed the US to dump a lot of its goods, some of its excess corn capacity on Mexico. So a lot of these small local farmers in Mexico could compete with these large industrial production process got crushed. It also hurt US workers because those jobs can now more easily be outsourced to Mexico. 2001, as I mentioned earlier, joined the WTO. US capital was outsourced to exploit Chinese labor because US companies wanted cheaper labor. The Chinese state also retained some leverage from this because manufacturing in China really began to boom after joining the WTO. 2016, another free trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The US actually backed out of this in 2017. Along the lines of that it would hurt workers. Hillary Clinton actually initially supported it, but then flip-flopped on that and opposed it, similar to Trump. 2020 COVID led to pretty large supply chain shocks and it impacted trade policy in terms of we see the shift toward friendshoring and securing supply chains more after COVID. And then finally, 2025, the Trump administration calls Liberation Day. They have universal 10% tariffs and reciprocal tariffs on 57 countries in the world. Their stated goals were to bring back manufacturing jobs and secure concessions from global trading partners by the US consumer market, using the US consumer market as leverage. So again, I mentioned the Plaza Accords before, but one of the key factors is that the US has the largest consumer markets in the world. So one of the things they're hoping to do is use the fact that Japan, Germany, some of these China, these manufacturing companies need to sell their goods into the US market. So they're trying to use that as leverage to get concessions. All right, so now I'll pass it over to Mahir to discuss the US dollar and dollar imperialism.
Cool. Well, hey everyone. So dollar and imperialism. We're going to do some talking about that, kind of explaining how it kind of ties into what Kyle was explaining, including the Plaza Accords and balance of payment and things like that. So to start off, we have dollar imperialism or dollar dominance or dollar hegemony. And that pretty much it talks about essentially the large role and the vast and powerful role that the US dollar plays in global trade and world trade essentially. And so we'll see and we'll explore how that actually is eventful and impactful. And so there's two diagrams here that I want to explain first. This graph over here on the left shows all transactions with different currencies from 2019, but essentially it kind of emphasizes how large the US dollar plays in global transactions. So currently it's around like 80 to 90% of all transactions use a US dollar. And the second graph shows the reserve currencies and the percentage of reserve currencies internationally for different currencies. So you have the US dollar, which is hovering around 56% of the entire world uses the US dollars as their reserve currency. And then we have other currencies as well that are kind of rising around 1970s or so. That's when the US dollar as a reserve currency kind of increased. But yeah, these are some like basic or generic understandings before we go on. So how exactly did we get here? We want to start off with the Bretton Woods Agreement. So essentially because of World War I and the Great Depression, you had a lot of economic turmoil and a lot of devastation, especially across Western Europe. And the United States, compared to those countries, was actually a lot more stable because it wasn't as impacted as the other countries. And so what happened was that in New Hampshire in 1944, towards the end of World War II, they all had like a conference, all these different countries, and they decided to make the United States and their currency, the US dollar, as the world reserve currency. And so essentially when we're talking about world reserve currency, we need to talk about central banks. And so a central bank essentially is they direct monetary policies, they do money distributions, and essentially they're the ones who determine like interest rates, for example, and they also hold on to reserve currencies. And these reserve currencies, they are foreign currencies typically that these countries hold for foreign transactions, for gold trade, for stock investments and things like that. And usually you want large amounts of reserve currencies so that you can do global transactions, for example, or even change your own exchange rates for your own currency. So that's what they decided at the Bretton Woods Conference. The first thing is to make the US dollar the world currency, and also to peg it to the gold and to peg other currencies to the US dollar. So when you talk about pegging currencies, you're essentially talking about a fixed exchange rate. So for example, in India, it's around $1 to 80 rupees, and it's kind of like their exchange rate. And when you fix something, you're essentially making it structured. You're going to keep it at that exchange rate throughout time. So if, for example, the euro decreases in value, you want to figure out a way to increase the value to keep it at the same exchange rate that you wanted beforehand, and that's how you keep it fixed. And so what they decided to do was, through the Bretton Woods Agreement, they made it $35 for an ounce of gold, and that's exactly how they kind of fixed US dollar to gold. And then you have these other countries that decided their own fixed exchange rate to the US dollar. Then after that, you had the Nixon shock. Essentially what happened was that this kind of erased the whole Bretton Woods Agreement without changing the fact that the US dollar would be like a world currency reserve. So what happened was that the United States decided to keep their US dollar pegged to gold. So that'd be $35 for an ounce of gold. And because the US dollar was now this extremely large currency, reserve currency, they were exporting large amounts of their US dollars across the globe and also funding their Vietnam War. And so all these other countries had lots and lots of dollars, and they found a way to exploit that by exchanging their numerous amounts of dollars for gold. So their gold reserves tanked tremendously. So Nixon was like, all right, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to stop pegging our currency to gold. And that's exactly what happened. And that created the fiat dollar system and floating currency exchange rate, which essentially means that the US dollar won't be pegged to gold anymore. And they'll be based off like their credibility and other market forces. There's not going to be like a stable standard anymore. And that's essentially what happened. And it kind of emphasizes the fact how powerful the United States is, especially when it comes to currency exchange. And if we fast forward a little bit, we have 1974 with the US-Saudi Arabia oil deal, and this kind of further emphasized the United States as the world reserve for currency, at least, because they created a deal between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and essentially that deal was the United States would give military funding back into Saudi Arabia, and in exchange, Saudi Arabia would only sell their oil in US dollars, creating a massive demand for US dollars. And in exchange for also that, what happened was that they made another deal where all the profit that Saudi Arabia made would go back into the US economy through treasuries and bonds and things like that, increasing the amount of funding that the United States would get internationally. This also helped exacerbate the debt that the United States had, because now they had to pay off all these like interest rates from all these bonds and things like that. And then in 1985, we had the Plaza Accords, which Kyle talked about. Essentially what happens is you have a lot of US dollars, and so there's a large demand for US dollars because it's the world currency, the reserve currency. And so the value of the dollar goes extremely high. And what happens is that imports become extremely cheap, but exports become extremely expensive. So manufacturing was decimated because of that. And they threatened during the Ronald Reagan era to create like protectionist laws, including like import quotas and tariffs to protect manufacturing in the US. And so Ronald Reagan and the administration essentially talked to like Germany and Japan, and they devalued the US dollar to increase the value of German currency and Japanese currency, and so on and so forth, essentially showcasing the manipulation that they can do with currencies and things like that. About debt, at least, we talked about exorbitant privilege. This is coined by the French, but essentially it talks about how we don't have the same disadvantages as other countries do when it comes to debt. So Kyle was talking about balance of payment, and there's a thing called balance of payment crisis. Example of this happened with Mexico in 1994, but essentially what happens is that you have so many imports, but you can't pay those imports with foreign currency because you lose all your reserve currency, essentially because you're importing so much. And so what happens is that the value of your own currency gets devalued, and you have high amounts of inflation and economic crisis. And the United States has a large amount of debt, and they don't have the same impacts that other countries would. This is because, again, the US dollar keeps getting recycled back into the US, and because the fact that the United States dollar is essentially used for all global trade, so they don't have to worry about running out of US dollar as a foreign currency. And so this graphic kind of shows how we have such large amounts of trade in the first place. Kind of similar to the Saudi Arabia example, but if you want to have your dollar or your currency be used as a reserve currency, you need to sell that currency to the world. And the way that other countries can get that currency is if they sell their imports to you. So your country will import a lot of goods from other countries, and then you'll export your currency to that. You'll buy it with your currency. And so that's what the United States did. You'll have all these other countries export their goods, the United States will buy them, and then they'll take these profits that they made from their imports and then reinvest them back into the United States as bonds and treasuries and securities and things like that. And because essentially if you buy a bond from the United States has to pay that bond back plus interest. And so the United States will now be in debt to. And so that's how they make large, that's essentially how they accrue so much debt. So there's some contradictions when it comes to dollar hegemony as well. Kyle touched on this a lot with the fact of manufacturing and exports, and also through the Plaza Accords. But essentially, there's kind of a step-by-step process when it comes to the disadvantages that Americans go through. And the first one is, so of course, you have a high demand for dollars, which means that imports are going to be a lot more affordable. If your dollar is worth a lot more, you can probably buy a lot more internationally. But that also means that if your dollar is worth a lot more, it's going to be a lot harder to sell whatever your dollar is worth to international. So that means that exports are going to be a lot more expensive, and a lot of countries won't be able to essentially buy your exports. And this was an issue for the United States, and specifically their manufacturing sector. So their manufacturing sector was seeing a lot of issues because other countries could not afford their exports. And this gives manufacturing industry two solutions: either they go out of business or they outsource, and that tends to be what happens. So they'll go to areas with more affordable labor and more affordable practices for them. And that accelerates the United States deindustrialization. So manufacturing is pretty much wiped out in the United States, and Americans lose jobs, specifically in the industrial sector. And of course, this is not just a disadvantage for Americans, but also for the entire world when it comes to monetary policy. So usually the way that trade works is that you'll have correspondent banks. The reason you'll have correspondent banks is because you'll have two countries, like for example, France, maybe India, and maybe their banks cannot transact in the other currency. So maybe the Indian bank can't transact in the euro, and a French bank can't transact in a rupee. And because the United States has the largest reserve currency, they might transact in US dollars. And so what they'll do is they'll use a correspondent bank, which you can think of it as like a middle bank, like a middle management bank, which will do the transaction for you. And because these banks use US dollars, they technically touch US soil and they're attached to the Federal Reserve, which means that they have to follow US monetary policy and US law. So whatever US laws have, these banks also have to follow, these correspondent banks, which means that if France and India want to be trading and they want to use this US correspondent bank, they have to follow US law as well. So if, for example, we'll touch on this with Renee with the sanctions, but if Iran is banned from the US dollar because of sanctions or some sort of other monetary policy, other countries can actually trade with them as at least in US dollars. So that's one example. Another is with the banks, with banning the SWIFT. So SWIFT is like a messaging broker for banks. So essentially, the way it works is you'll have like a bank talk to another bank. They'll give some like secured information to them kind of to validate the transaction, and then they'll send the money, like wiring it. And SWIFT is used by a majority of banks throughout the world. And in 2012 and 2018, Iran was banned from SWIFT banking. And so essentially, they weren't able to do a lot of international trade. So that's another example of how the United States can like manage and essentially enforce their own monetary policy when it comes to global trade, specifically because the United States dollar is used in a majority of global trade, and it's because it's the largest reserve currency. With that, I'll give it over to my comrade Bernard, who will expand upon this even more.
Thank you so much, Kyle and Nick, for really like setting the stage. And I know this is like a lot of information and it's kind of dense. And this is, I think, kind of the point. I always think about that scene in the movie The Big Short, where they talk about the reason why all these assholes on Wall Street use this jargon, and it's so complicated because they want you to not understand how this stuff works. That way they can get away with screwing over American workers, the American economy. It's the same thing happens with why, imperialists want this to be really complicated and confusing to all of us, which is why projects like this are so important to help raise our level of education and awareness. And before I jump into sort of what sanctions are and how they work in light of everything that Kyle and me here just said, I want to just sort of build on what my comrade said to say that, putting this in the context that we talked about last week of how imperialism should be understood, right? As the division of the world into the core and the periphery, the core being the advanced capitalist developed countries, usually former colonial powers plus the United States, and the periphery being everyone else, where the global economy is set up on the exploitation of the periphery by the core. Remember, everything we're talking about now comes on the heels of centuries of colonial plunder, right? Where countries in the third world, the global south, had their resources, their labor stripped from them, they weren't allowed to develop, they were forced into a position of essentially being exporters of cheap commodities and raw materials, and that continues even after they get independence. Meaning that if they want to buy food, if they want to buy technology so they can build their infrastructure, they can develop their economy, they need to buy that from the countries doing the advanced manufacturing. Those are the countries in the core. Like my comrades just talked about, in order to make those purchases, they need dollars. Because dollars are the currency that's used for the vast majority of global trade. So this is really how the global trade regime and the hegemony of the United States dollar serves to reinforce the dependency that the global south continues to be trapped in relative to the imperial core. And all of this is reinforced, of course, by military coercion and interventions and so on. One of the big reasons why the US has an interest in dollar recycling is because when countries, especially oil-rich countries in the Gulf, for example, pump their dollars back into the US economy, buying treasury bonds, buying US government debt, that funds the US government spending. And we all know the largest chunk of America's government spending goes to the Pentagon. Right, that's the reason why we have $1 trillion military budget. That's not coming from tax revenue. That's coming largely from deficit spending, which is financed by the recycling of US dollars that are exported to the rest of the world in the process that we've talked about so far. But in addition to the military, the title of the series is Beyond the Bombs. We want to look beyond just immediate military intervention. One of the other major coercive measures that the United States and therefore the rest of the imperial core uses to uphold its dominance in the world system is through sanctions. So what are sanctions? It's a very broad umbrella term, which really refers to any sort of policy that imposes a financial or trade-related penalty by one country on another country. And these can take many different forms. It could be travel bans on individuals. Often you hear travel bans or visa restrictions placed on government officials. It could be asset freezes. It could be arms embargoes, restrictions on financial transactions, all the way up to a total blockade, essentially like siege warfare from the Middle Ages, where you choke off a country's economy altogether. So it's a very broad umbrella term. And sanctions can be imposed by individual states or by international bodies like the UN Security Council, the EU. But by far, bar none, the United States is the biggest imposing force of sanctions in the world. The Washington Post, all these graphs come from a Washington Post article in 2024, which really dives into how successive US presidents have built up America's reputation as a major sanctioner. And this article notes that the US imposes, quote, 3 times as many sanctions as any other country or international body, targeting a third of all nations with some kind of financial penalty on people, properties, or organizations. And the article also notes that of all the low-income countries in the world, the developing countries, 60% of them face some form of US sanction. And again, those vary in severity, they vary in how sweeping they are. But the fact that 60% of low-income countries are being sanctioned in some way, shape, or form by the most powerful imperial country the world has ever seen, I think really says a lot about how central the US is in this system, which is why for the rest of this teach-in, we're going to focus primarily on US sanctions rather than looking at UN or EU sanctions, because they just really pale in comparison to the scale of what we're talking about here. So the purpose of sanctions are typically imposed to try and coerce a country into changing its behavior, whether changing policy or undergoing regime change, and trying to coerce them into doing that through applying economic pressure. In some cases, the purpose is overthrowing the existing government. And the most extreme example, probably the most notorious example of this, is the US blockade on Cuba, which has, essentially been imposed pretty much since the Cuban Revolution in 1959. And in 1960, the US's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, a man named Lester Mallory, wrote a memo, a very damning memo that has been declassified, and that really gets to the heart of why the US imposed, a blockade on Cuba. And in the memo, Mallory writes, quote, "Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy is adopted, it should make the greatest inroad in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government." So really, in its most raw and sort of cruel form, the purpose of sanctions is to create a level of desperation among the citizens of a country that either they'll rise up and overthrow the government the US wants out of power, or the fear of that happening will force that government to then change course and change whatever policy is pissing the United States off. Now, sanctions are often presented largely by liberals as a less costly and a more humane alternative to traditional warfare, other forms of military coercion. That is straightforwardly a lie, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But to get into sort of how sanctions work in practice, in the US, they're administered primarily by the Treasury Department, actually not the State Department, as you might think, and specifically by an office within the Treasury Department called OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, and which cooperates with state and other US departments and government agencies to impose and then enforce these sanctions. At the international level, the US often goes to the UN Security Council, as I mentioned, to pass resolutions that then compel UN member states to comply with sanctions. But that can be hard to enforce. And the US usually goes the route of unilaterally imposing sanctions. Anyway, it's such a powerful country, it has the ability to do that and knows that other countries will comply. And violating sanctions that have been listed by OFAC have very steep penalties. So it can have a prison sentence of up to 20 years and fines of up to $1 million for each individual violation that you're found guilty of. So that's, the US really imposes this through threat of really extreme penalties. And sanctions take various different forms. The main distinction is between targeted and comprehensive sanctions. So targeted, or in scare quotes, targeted sanctions are applied against individuals, specific firms, specific industries. There's not a single centralized list. You can't look up who is every entity that has a targeted sanction on them. But one such list that OFAC has is called the Specially Designated Nationals, or SDNs list. And that has over 17,000 names on it. So this is a really widely used tactic. And if somebody whose name is on that SDN list owns the majority stake in a business, then that business is also considered to be covered by those sanctions. More severe, though, than targeted sanctions are what's called comprehensive sanctions. These target entire economies, entire countries, and effectively cut them off from the global economy by prohibiting all transactions that don't get specific approval. So as of 2025, the countries that are considered to be under comprehensive sanctions were Cuba, Iran, North Korea, certain regions of Ukraine, and then Syria, although in May, after sort of concessions by the new Syrian regime, Trump announced that he'd be lifting those comprehensive sanctions on Syria. And that's actually a really good example of when those sanctions were imposed against Assad, and when a country undergoes the regime change that the United States wants, and someone comes into power who was friendly to the West, who's talking about opening up Syria to foreign investment and allying with the United States, those sanctions can get lifted overnight. So it's actually really, that happened while we were working on the deadline for this presentation, and the studying development also really shows just how quickly this can happen. There's also then a distinction between what's called primary and secondary sanctions. So primary sanctions require compliance from any US national, any resident of the United States. It doesn't have to be a citizen. If you are on US soil, you are expected to comply. If you're a business or an organization based in the US, you're covered by these. And so it also covers US citizens or permanent residents regardless of where you are in the world. So if I'm an American living in London or whatever, I can't do business with a sanctioned entity because I'm still covered by these, as well as any entities that are either organized or incorporated in the US, as well as any foreign branches that they might have. It also covers anyone who is engaging in transactions that are processed via the US financial system or that are conducted in US dollars, which, as we just talked about, is pretty much all of that. So, for example, you're talking about Cuba again, it's illegal for American individuals or firms to do business with Cuban nationals because of the trade embargo. And that's a form of primary sanctions on a mass scale. I don't know if anyone here at the event that we did at the Cuban embassy about a month ago now, where there was a sign at the bar that said you're not allowed to take our bartenders because of the embargo. Technically, that would be considered engaging in a transaction with a Cuban national, and that would be, $1 million fine per violation. So that was like the first time that I found myself face to face with like what that actually looks like in practice. You can't take a bartender. That's crazy. And this is happening all over the world every day on a global scale. So those are primary sanctions, but the US doesn't stop there. We also have what's called secondary sanctions, which go one step farther. By targeting third parties in other countries, the small sliver of people who are not covered by primary sanctions, but these third parties, if they want to do business with an individual, an entity, or a state who is subject to primary sanctions by the US, even if it would be completely illegal for them to do so under their jurisdiction, secondary sanctions still make it legal to do that. Essentially, it means that you are a third party, you want to do business with a sanctioned entity, that's fine, you're free to do so, but then you'll be sanctioned yourself, which means that you actually aren't free to do so. In 2011, for example, Hillary Clinton, who was then Obama's Secretary of State, imposed penalties against 7 non-American companies for violating US sanctions on Iran's energy industry because they were selling tankers and other oil refinement materials, oil production materials to Iran. And even though they weren't subject to US law, they were not covered by US jurisdiction, the US still sanctioned them. That's an example of secondary sanctions in action. And the US's use of sanctions has dramatically increased over time. So the Treasury Department estimates that between 2001 to 2021, US use of sanctions increased more than 900%. And it continues to grow, in large part because you get this sort of narrative that sanctions are cheaper, less costly, both financially, but also have less of a human cost. They're a more humane alternative to traditional warfare. But as I said before, this is a myth. They make it much harder for our sanctioned countries to access and import basic human needs. I'm talking about food, medicine, materials to develop your infrastructure, construction materials. All of these things are much harder to access, especially for countries whose economies are reliant on importing these things. And as we talked about, much of the global south is in that position because of their dependent status within the world system. And that's especially true, obviously, for comprehensive sanctions. If you're under comprehensive sanctions, you can't import things that you need. But even so-called targeted sanctions often have similar negative consequences as well. There's a 2023 report by CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which is a really great think tank that has a very critical perspective on the international political economy. And this report was essentially a literature review, 32 different peer-reviewed studies that had measured the impact of sanctions on human development and economic development in targeted countries. So it was 32 different peer-reviewed studies that had been published. And CEPR found that of those 32 studies, 30 of them have found negative impacts on outcomes ranging from per capita income to poverty, inequality, mortality, and human rights. So the expert literature is pretty much unanimous that whether it's comprehensive sanctions or targeted sanctions, these make it harder for ordinary people. And it's not the ruling elites in sanctioned countries that pay the price, but it's ordinary, everyday people who can't get the medicine they need, who can't get the food that they need. And we'll go more into detail of like what that looks like in some specific case studies that we'll really dive into to show just how devastating even supposedly targeted sanctions can be. I want to go back to a So briefly, what Mihir was talking about with dollar dominance, maybe concretize that a little bit of how it enables US imperial hegemony by enabling US sanctions. So in 2023, Marco Rubio, he's then a US senator, now Secretary of State, wrote an op-ed in the British conservative newspaper The Telegraph. And the title of the op-ed was called, quote, "Tyrannical China wants to topple the US dollar." And he's very scared about the US dollar being toppled by tyrannical China or by anyone else, and frankly, for good reason. So you see in this quote what he says, quote, "When the Soviet Union fell, the US became the world's preeminent superpower. That position, one of military, economic, and cultural dominance, gave America an unmatched ability to influence global events. Chief among the tools at our disposal were financial and banking sanctions. Sanctions allowed us to pursue our foreign policy interests without boots on the ground or planes in the sky. And they were both symbolically and tangibly effective because every major nation was plugged into a global financial system built on the US dollar and US banks." So let's unpack what that means, right? We have established the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, which means that if you are a country, a small country, a formerly colonized nation, you want to conduct any sort of trade, any sort of international transaction, you need dollars to do that. But if the US has imposed sanctions against you, has essentially, cut you off from the dollar system, from the American financial system, you can't get the dollars that you need because you can't trade. You can't export the raw materials that you produce and then get those dollars that you need to trade. And then it also becomes effectively impossible for you to trade with whatever dollar reserves you do have. And so what that does is it essentially strangles your economy and it turns up this pressure, which is exactly how sanctions function as coercive measures. You often actually hear them referred to by critical economists as UCMs, unilateral coercive measures, because that is really what they are. And this is why the US ruling class, as evidenced by the tone that Rubio strikes in this op-ed, is so worried about the growing interest that we're seeing among global South countries, particularly the BRICS nation, in what's called de-dollarization, looking to alternative currencies, whether that's the Chinese yuan or creating new regional currencies to engage in global trade. And we'll talk more about what that's looking like in week 6 about the shifting global order. But the reason why it scares the ruling class so much in the US is because it means that if there are countries that turn into other currencies, that means that if a country is under US sanctions, it's no longer cut off to the same degree from the world economy, and then it's easier for them to evade sanctions. And this is a bipartisan fear. It's not just hawks like Rubio who are talking about this, but in 2023, with Fareed Zakaria, Biden's Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was giving an interview on CNN. And in that interview with Fareed Zakaria, she warned that US use of sanctions could undermine the dollar's hegemony by driving countries to pursue alternatives. She says, quote, "There's a risk when we use financial sanctions that are linked to the role of the dollar, that over time, it could undermine the hegemony of the dollar. It does create a desire on the part of China, Russia, Iran to find an alternative." Now compare that with this quote from Rubio's op-ed, the same op-ed, quote, "In 2022, Russia launched a transfer system to trade with China independent of Western banks. The yuan has since surpassed the dollar as the most traded currency inside Russia. Meanwhile, this January, Russia and Iran linked their financial systems. In other words, by working together, the tyrannical regimes of Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran can now blunt the impact of US policies." I mean, here you have Biden's Treasury Secretary and now Trump's Secretary of State essentially saying the exact same thing about how important dollar dominance is to sanction, and conversely, how important sanctions are to dollar dominance. So I want to now, with the time that I have left, get into 2 case studies, first of which being US sanctions against Iran, which is until 2022, until the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was the most sanctioned country in the world. It's been subject to many different sanctions from various actors over the last several decades, but primarily by the US. The main focus has been curbing Iran's nuclear program, nuclear production, and also stopping Iranian support for the atoms resistance for groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Yeah.
Sorry. They started in '79 when there were no nukes nor.
Yes, and that's actually a good point, that this does go back to 1979, before any sort of nuclear program or anything, because really what the sanctions are about is regime change in Iran, even though the stated purpose is usually listed as something a little bit more sort of limited than that. But yes, so this is not an exhaustive list, but some examples of this timeline over time. In 1979, you had the Iranian Revolution, the overthrow of the Shah by the Islamic Republic, and the hostage crisis, you've seen the movie Argo, that's what that's about. And after that, the US imposed a trade embargo against Iran, froze $8.1 billion in Iranian government assets, and those sanctions were in place until 1981. Then in the nineties, you have the Clinton administration, which really severely tightened the sanctions against Iran that had been loosened for a while, largely in response to the nuclear program, as well as in response to Iran's support for Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So in 1995, Clinton signed two executive orders, which declare a national emergency and ban all trade and investment with Iran, which that is still in effect. The national emergency declaration is renewed every year by the US president. Bush did it, Obama did it, Trump did it, Biden did it, now Trump's doing it again. Again, there's one thing that's a bipartisan consensus, that is imperialism. And then in 1996, 1 year later, the Congress passed the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, which imposed secondary sanctions against both US and non-US companies who do business with Iran's oil industry. In 2006, the Bush administration sanctioned Iran's largest bank, Bank Saderat, along with other Iranian financial institutions throughout the rest of the 2000s, early 2010s. When the Obama administration negotiated the nuclear deal with Iran in 2015, one of the key elements of that was the lifting of US, UN, and EU sanctions. This was a huge deal for Iran, which had been strangled for decades by these. But in 2018, when Trump withdraws, he scraps the Iran nuclear deal, the US doubles down on these sanctions again. And after exiting the nuclear deal, Trump imposed what was called a maximum pressure sanctions campaign, which is intended specifically to destroy Iran's oil exports, because Iran's economy is very largely reliant on oil. This is something that you often see. And he reimposed this maximum pressure campaign after returning to office earlier this year. So just to get into what have the impact of sanctions on Iran. Nominally, these are meant to target the government, but it's ordinary Iranians who pay the price for them. Since the US abandoned Iran's nuclear deal and reimposed the maximum pressure campaign in 2019, Iran's rial, which is its currency, has lost more than 90% of its value. The inflation rate in Iran for the last 5 years has averaged around 40%, and food prices in particular have been hit especially hard by that inflation. I think it's even higher than 40% in the food sector specifically. You've seen shortages of basic medicines and medical supplies, including critical treatments for cancer, heart conditions, HIV/AIDS. And there was a 2016 study which found that this was before the maximum pressure campaign, so it's gotten worse since then. This identified 73 drugs that face shortages in Iran due to sanctions, and nearly half of those are drugs that are classified by the WHO as essential medicine. The study says, quote, Iran continues to face ongoing challenges to importing life-saving medicines, supplies, and medical raw materials from the US and EU. This has resulted in an estimated 6 million Iranian patients who lack access to essential treatment needed to address highly prevalent communicable and non-communicable diseases within the country. And the reason why this has been the case is because sanctions have essentially cut Iran off from the international financial system, which means it can't conduct the transactions that it needs to import drugs. And also, it means that Iran's oil production has been decimated. It can't sell its oil, which is the primary export by which it gets the foreign reserves that it needs to import medicines, import food, and so on. And this graph in particular shows just the up and down of Iranian oil production as sanctions are imposed, and then lifted, and it shoots back up to before sanctions. But in 2018, when sanctions are reinstated, oil production tanks once again in Iran. Iran is a really heartbreaking example. I think there were some really horrifying stories, particularly during the COVID pandemic, that came out of Iran. People from Iran who are talking about the impacts of having on their families, their loved ones back home. It's ordinary people who pay the price. They talk about the quote unquote regime, but really it's ordinary Iranians who pay the price, as has always been the case. And this is also true in another particularly notorious case study that I want to focus on, which is US sanctions against Venezuela. So Venezuela, I think, is an important example to look at because the US media loves to talk about Venezuela. It's closer to the US, to our backyard, than Iran is, and the US media loves to report on the authoritarianism of the Maduro regime's tyrannical dictatorship and this economic crisis caused by the failures of socialism, right? That's the narrative that you hear in US media coverage of Venezuela. You never hear talked about the sanctions, or if you do hear sanctions talked about, it's to dismiss them, to say that sanctions actually haven't played a big role in Venezuela's crisis. But if you actually get into the details, that's not true. And before I talk about that, just to, again, run through a quick history of sanctions on Venezuela. So before Trump, under the Obama administration in particular, there were much more specific targeted sanctions placed against President Maduro and other government officials who were accused of human rights abuses, corruption, and other things. And so they would have visa restrictions, freezes on their personal assets under the Obama administration. But by and large, the sanctions under Obama were, generally speaking, more targeted. They really became expanded under Trump. Initially, Trump expanded sanctions on individual government officials, but then also quickly began targeting industries more broadly. So in 2017 and 2018, Trump signed a series of executive orders that effectively cut off Venezuela's government, including the state-owned oil company PDVSA, which is the backbone of Venezuela's economy. Much like Iran, Venezuela's exports are largely reliant on oil. It cut off all government enterprises, including the oil company, from trading and borrowing in US financial markets. And then in 2019, Trump followed this up. You had this coup attempt by the right-wing opposition leader Juan Guaido, failed coup attempt in which the US recognized Juan Guaido as a supposedly legitimate president of Venezuela. And alongside that recognition of Guaido, Trump signed another executive order, which froze any US-based assets of the Venezuelan oil company. That was around $7 billion in assets, and then prevented all US nationals from doing business with the Venezuelan oil company. This is significant because the US accounted for 41% of Venezuelan oil exports. And those 2019 sanctions also went after Venezuela's gold industry, which after crude and refined oil is Venezuela's third largest export. So essentially, this is a policy also, like with Iran, of maximum pressure aimed at choking off the economy and bringing Venezuela to its knees. And what we've seen is a really devastating impact of these sanctions, which have exacerbated the economic crisis in Venezuela. You often hear the narrative by both liberal and conservative media that the economic collapse in Venezuela, it precedes sanctions, that it's actually just shows that socialism doesn't work. The truth is, the crisis in Venezuela is complex and it has numerous causes. One of which was, prior to 2016, a collapse in global oil prices. It affected every oil exporting nation on earth. This destabilized the economy that was overwhelmingly reliant on oil exports. But in 2017 onwards, sanctions have made it impossible for Venezuela's economy to recover from that oil collapse. Even as oil prices have rebounded, and other countries that similarly were affected by the price collapse have started to recoup their losses as well. And this graph really is illustrated because it compares Venezuela, which is the dark blue line, with Colombia, another major, literally its neighbor, and another major oil producing country in Latin America, which is the light blue line. You see, in 2016, oil prices fall. Both Venezuela and Colombia experienced steep declines, pretty equivalent declines in oil production. But then, in August 2017, the US imposes sanctions on Venezuela. Around this time, oil prices are starting to recover. Colombia's oil production also starts to recover. Venezuela's tanks, even more so. So this idea that sanctions have nothing to do with the economic crisis in Venezuela is completely ridiculous, and it's just not backed up by the facts at all.
That's the point of the sanctions, right?
That's exactly the point of the sanctions. But it becomes very easy then, and this is all very complicated, too complicated for a 30-second news bite on CNN. It's much easier for the anchor to talk about the tyrannical regime that's oppressing its people and socialism doesn't work, and then we move on to the next 24-hour news cycle, which is how these narratives are able to reinforce themselves. At the time, in 2019, when these sanctions were imposed, John Bolton, who was Trump's first-term national security advisor, estimated they would cost Venezuela's economy some $11 billion a year in lost oil exports. In 2020, there was a study conducted by a Venezuelan economist, Luis Oliveros, who I should note is a pretty critical of the government. He did it for a think tank that is by no means, a left-wing think tank. And he found that over 3 years, sanctions cost Venezuela between $17 and $31 billion in lost oil revenues. So that pretty much is in line with the estimate that John Bolton had said when the sanctions were first being imposed. And so I think this is a really good example of the myth of so-called targeted sanctions, because even though sanctions in Venezuela have been targeted against specific individuals, specific firms on paper, in practice, they have major ripple effects. And one of the reasons for this is because of overcompliance by banks and other firms around the world who maybe actually technically they wouldn't be caught up by these sanctions, and they would be able to do business. But they're so afraid of these massive penalties, of coming under scrutiny themselves, that they err on the side of caution. And then they restrict economic activity more than it should be, even under the sanctions themselves. Mahir talked about correspondent banks, these foreign banks that are so critical to processing international transactions. Between 2011 and 2019, Venezuela saw a 65% decline in the number of foreign banks willing to process its international transactions. So even if it could find a trading partner who wanted to do business with it, couldn't find banks to actually facilitate those transactions. And during that time, it also saw a 99% decline in the value of its foreign transactions as a result of that. And this can have really, really major humanitarian effects. So for example, a human rights group in Venezuela called Suris reported to the UN Special Rapporteur on Sanctions that there was a case where Citibank refused to transfer funds for an imported shipment of 300,000 insulin doses. Again, because they were so afraid of running afoul of these sanctions. You also had pharmaceutical companies like Abbott and Pfizer, which were suddenly refusing to issue export certificates to Venezuela for cancer treatments. So this is how over compliance, again, this is part of how sanctions work. The US is relying on other entities to over comply and therefore, essentially do the state's job for it. So staying on the humanitarian impact of this, a 2019 report from CEPR, from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, found that, quote, nearly all the foreign exchange needed to import medicine, food, medical equipment, spare parts and equipment for electricity generation, water systems, or transport is received by Venezuela's economy through government revenue from oil. Thus, any sanctions that reduce export earnings and therefore government revenue thereby reduce the import of these essential and in many cases life-saving goods. The report then goes on to find that from 2017 to 2018, general mortality in Venezuela increased by 31%. That's some 40,000 excess deaths. And it can't go so far as to definitively attribute all of those to sanctions, but it's given everything that we've just said, it seems almost impossible to anyone who's looking at this logically, that sanctions were not a major, if not the most significant contributing factor to those 40,000 excess deaths. Again, those are deaths that were 40,000 above what we should have seen in terms of mortality rate in Venezuela. Some more stats to really drive this home. In 2013, Venezuela imported $11.2 billion in food imports. In 2018, Venezuelan food imports were just $2.46 billion. And especially damning, this quote that's up here on the slide, reported by the UN Special Rapporteur on Sanctions, Elena Duhan, found that Venezuela's medical system is almost entirely reliant on imports, and sanctions have contributed, as is the case with Iran, to 85% shortages in necessary and essential medicine. And from the report, she says, quote, sectoral sanctions on the oil, gold, and mining industries, the economic blockade, the freezing of central bank assets, the targeted sanctions imposed on Venezuelans and third country nationals and companies, and the over-compliance by banks and third country companies have exacerbated pre-existing economic and fiscal crisis and have devastating effects on the entire population, especially those living in poverty, women, children, older persons, persons with disabilities or life-threatening chronic diseases, and the indigenous population. No strata of society has been untouched. So again, anytime someone tells you that, the sanctions in Venezuela are really just going after the regime, it's just the corrupt, party officials and so on, the United Nations begs to differ. Every single strata of Venezuelan society is paying the price for US imperialist sanctions against that country. So I want to conclude now by returning to the speech by Stephen Miran, this quote, and invite you all to reflect on everything we talked about today in light of what we see when we turn on the news every day, right? The trade wars, these tariffs, the ways that the Trump administration really is upending the consensus that has underpinned the US's role in the trade system, the US dollar's role as the global reserve currency. This is really shaking up the world in a lot of really, I think, ways that we can't quite tell the implications just yet. And we're gonna, again, week 6, get into more trying to look ahead and predict what do we think is going to come from all of this. But there's a great article in the most recent issue of Monthly Review looking at what does imperialism look like under Trump. But clearly Trump was drawing the US into a more protectionist, isolationist stance, but no one can say that Trump is not a figurehead of American empire. And there's a lot of people saying that the type of American empire that Trump wants to see is one that's more characterized by the US having a sphere of influence. This is why he's talking about, taking over Greenland and Panama and Canada as well. Something that's more akin to empires of the 17th, 18th centuries, rather than a global imperial world system that we've been talking about thus far over the last 2 weeks. That creates a lot of chaos and uncertainty, but also to us as anti-imperialists, I think that does create some opportunities as well, which again, we'll be talking about throughout the rest of this series. So we'll pause there and open it up for questions from folks. The question back here.
Yeah, it's been really helpful. Thank you so much. My question is, why do countries have an incentive to invest back into treasury bonds?
It's a really good question. I would say the reason why these countries have an incentive to invest in the US treasury bond is precisely because the US is the most powerful country on earth. It's an economic superpower. It has the most powerful military on earth to back itself up.
There's 600
Yeah,
bases, a
600
third of the
bases.
world has a military presence.
Right, exactly. So that means that people trust the US. If you're a younger, less powerful country, right, you don't have as much faith that if you're buying that country's government bond, you'll be able to make good on that debt when they don't get that money.
Right.
No one really doubts that of the US, although that's starting to change in part because of the chaos from Trump's tariffs. Go
I think you
ahead.
should not trust capitalists. US assets are the safest also because if you try to move away with them, you're gonna end up with a bullet in your head. In my country, we say we have a dead prime minister to prove it. I'm from Italy, so a key part of the story is US disciplining the North to discipline the global South. There are many countries, as to the Iranian situation, the French were building cars and wanted to build more for show. As soon as the sanctions were lifted, the Italian president was at the book fair in Tehran. But those leaders and those elites are terrified of contravening the secondary sanctions. When I moved to the United States 30 years ago, that's been introduced to Libya and Iran sanctions, and at that time, not everything was as digital. So there was a lot of transactions you could do. That would kind of stay under, and also the ability to implement the sanctions by US. Was more paper-based, really, so. So the value of secondary sanctions is to discipline other sufficiently powerful markets and economies, because that's how you really strangle your targets. So it's not simply the choice of the safest assets, it's not a macroeconomic choice, it's a macroeconomic choice, but that sits inside this other set of structures and patterns. That's why we're transitioning from a free trade model, but it wasn't so free, to another model that's not so free, it's not the open trade model. So, and NATO is not a protection racket for Europeans, it's a control racket over Europeans. And when Bretton Woods was set up, most of the European countries that were getting subsumed into the dollar zone, they themselves still had all colonial countries underneath. So you really, by structuring 12 countries, you were structuring the entire world system minus the Soviet Union, which we didn't really talk about because now it's ancient history.
How the contradictions of US economic hegemony and dollar imperialism contributed to the rise of Trump, the MAGA far right. How should this shape our understanding of and therefore our resistance to the Trump administration, especially based here in DC, where next week Trump's having a military parade through our streets. Second question to think about or discuss is what would it mean for the US to be displaced from its hegemonic position in the world economy as a trade superpower, with the dollar hegemony or any of the other ways that comes up. And what challenges and opportunities would that pose to us as socialists, again, in the heart of empire, who are trying to organize the American working class? So if there's questions about stuff that was covered at the presentation, feel free to keep asking them. And also, I do invite and encourage folks to reflect on either of these special questions as well.
Depending on how old you are, you will remember or not NAFTA, but that was like the beginning of a breach inside the Democratic Party. And it's a traditional constituency built through the New Deal and Southern support. One of the reasons they're given of the Trump winning is the crisis of the industrialization. I don't think that actually fits, I'm a trade unionist, I don't think that it really fits the blue collar American worker against workers across the globe. I think that it's a process of extraction from both sides. One thing we didn't center enough because it's impossible to do so is that 70% of trade is through corporations, right? We're here to talk about capitalism and finance sits atop. And so you have this interaction between the privatized space of finance and the public facing side of finance between the states, but then with the US as the apex. And then of course you do have the power of the gun. So what do we do different? And how do we not turn this just into an intellectual exercise, but as we organize? Because right now the far right is organizing America and the world to almost crank the heat, maybe to retreat from the whole globe, but go heavier on what is left in its control. How do we organize the working class in America on an anti-imperialist position, not just like to help people in the global south? Because I would say the American working class hasn't done particularly well in the last 30 years of maximum domination by its elite of the global system. And how do we build solidarity across the globe? So maybe if we can like articulate that, because we're gonna have election in 2 years, and then another set, and AOC and Bernie, for example, are still on the liberal imperialist line. I mean, they sided with the sanctions on Venezuela, we have millions of refugees. These things never connect, and then people hate immigrants, and people hate everyone lost their job, rightly so to so-called free trade. And it's the far right that's from at least Europe to the United States and not only are organizing, then there's no solidarity in it.
Yeah, and just to that point, something that, I was thinking about after last week's session is that we've been talking a lot about the US as the beneficiary of the imperialist world system. The US sits at the head of the table, which is all true, but that's also true at sort of like the high level. It's the US ruling class that is benefiting from all of this, right? But like, sure, the US is getting all of this, money being funneled back into it from dollars that are being invested into treasuries, then finance the government deficit spending. But that spending isn't going to education, it's not going to healthcare, it's not fixing all the roads or bridges or any of that, right? It's not addressing the material needs of American working people. It's going to $1 trillion Pentagon budget. And that like it's ultimately the reason why the US wants to maintain the system is because it benefits US capital, not because it benefits American people. I think that when we're talking about how do we make this case to workers, how do we make this case to Americans, you can't just go say, well, you benefit from imperialism, the same way it doesn't work to go tell your white people they benefit from white supremacy and just sort of leave it there. It's not how you organize people. I think making this case that this actually isn't benefiting ordinary Americans.
Could you speak to the significance of de-dollarization that is happening now? For example, with the growth of BRICS, do you think US financial dominance is now increasing?
It's a good question. I mean, there is like a growing trend of like, at least level of rhetoric, the leaders in Brazil and Russia, of various countries have been talking at their summits more about wanting to pursue alternatives, whether it's doing more trade as you want, but also talking about creating a common currency for BRICS nations. The BRICS is expanding every year, the countries that are in it. At the same time, though, like that progress has actually been relatively tepid, and there's been a decline in the percentage of global reserves that are held in US dollars, but that decline is from like an extremely large majority to a slightly less large majority over the last 10-15 years. So the reality is that the US dollar is still pretty undisputed, not pretty, it is undisputedly the hegemonic currency in the world. But de-dollarization is something that clearly, as the quotes from Marco Rubio and Janet Yellen show, something the ruling class is very scared about, and they're investing a lot of their energy trying to prevent that from happening. As Mateo says, a gun to your head is a very, very powerful incentive, and the US does still have that. It can put a gun to the head of anyone that it wants, whether a literal gun or a financial gun in the form of sanctions, and that does make it harder for countries to, pursue alternatives. We saw what they did to Gaddafi when he wanted the United States of Africa. We saw what they did to Thomas Sankara when he talked about not paying back debts. So it's a yes and no, I would say. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I know this is a much more in-depth discussion, but I hope you all found it informative. We'll be back here same time, 4 p.m. next Sunday to talk about international finance and empire. Thanks all so much. See you next week.